Okay, well, let's pivot to the war in Gaza and this longstanding fact that Israel is really is as I forget who coined this line, but it has been treated as the Jew among nations for as long as it has been a nation. Um, let's take that piece first. I mean, I want to talk about the war in Gaza and what you expect there, but it seems to me that Israel has completely lost. I mean, I don't think that's putting it too strongly. An information war with the rest of the world. I mean, there's something about a failure of public relations here that is proving catastrophic, not just to Israel and its standing in the world, but to the perception of Jews outside of Israel at this moment. I mean, we've seen this explosion of anti-Semitism globally. To some degree, the war in Gaza is one could imagine a pretext to express something that at an ambient level of anti-Semitism that's already there. But I think in other contexts, it is creating an animus toward Jews that certainly in people where you wouldn't expect it. So we just have this larger global problem of the greatest efflorescence of anti-Semitism we've seen in our lifetime, and Israel's status, virtual status as a pariah nation among nations that really should know better. I mean, because again, the moral asymmetries here between Israel and her enemies, and we'll get into them, are are beyond obvious, right? I mean, this is not a hard call, and yet everything is upside down, and crucially, everything was upside down not just in response to Israel's invasion of Gaza, but prior to that, before. I mean, this is how we can dissect the level of moral confusion suffered by most of the free world at this moment. On October 8th, before Israel had responded, you had our most elite institutions effectively taking the side of Hamas, in certain cases explicitly taking the side of Hamas. Um, so how did we get here? Right. Again, we'll get into the details of Gaza. We'll get into many of the lies and half truths that anchor people to this confusion. But like, how is it that this war, this information war, seems to have been lost up until this point?
There's so much. There's so much to say. It's hard to know when to
Mm.
start. Where to begin? I would say, first of all, the projection of one's anxieties and concerns about the war in Gaza onto your local Jewish community is such obvious rabid bigotry that and nobody in the West would be confused on this question if you applied it to Muslims or if you applied it to Hindus.
Or the Chinese?
India
I don't see
or the
Chinese Americans
Chinese.
being blamed for the behavior of the CCP. Yeah.
Right. And so there's just no, it's just, maybe China doesn't claim to represent all Chinese, but there are plenty of Muslim states doing plenty of horrific things at
Mm.
scales an order of magnitude larger than Gaza. In the worst case scenario that you believe of Israel in Gaza, that claim to represent Islam, and nobody comes to the Muslim community in America or in Britain or in Canada and says to them, "Explain yourselves." So no, none of that is legitimate in any way. It's just an anti-Semitism that is permissible in elite circles because it has a cachet in Western civilization, given to Western civilization, an inheritance of the Christian tradition that makes it okay, makes it recognizable, and therefore not something that feels dangerous and upsetting. So I don't have to respect that even slightly. I don't
Mm.
have to respect that at all. Israel will commit crimes. Israel will make mistakes. Israel is a country. I've never sat in a room with Americans and said to them, America makes terrible mistakes and sometimes real crimes, and had any American ever fall off their chair. Not a single one, no matter how patriotic they are. Israel's a real country, and it's going to make those mistakes. And if you then come to your Jewish community in Cleveland, Ohio, with complaints, you are the bigot, and there's nothing else to know about that situation.
Mm.
So that's the first point. The second point is a lot of it is Israel's fault. he said, immediately after saying the first thing. And what I mean by Israel's fault is one of the most beautiful things about us is one of the most catastrophic things in wartime. And that is that we are a people culturally profoundly incapable of explaining ourselves. And it comes from a very deep and very old place. In the late 19th century, the pogroms begin. There's a specific moment, the death of Tsar Alexander II at the hand of anarchist assassins in 1881 in St. Petersburg. He was this reformist czar who abolished serfdom and was this guy that many Jews hoped would deliver for the Jews, would end the Pale of Settlements, would end the anti-Semitic laws of the Russian Empire. And when he dies, his reactionary son, Alexander III, takes over. This is 1881. And one of his first acts is to pass massively anti-Semitic laws that tighten the regime of restrictions on Jewish lives in the empire, the May laws of 1882. And that's when we see the beginning of what would be 40 years and more of mass pogroms that would become something like 1,300 pogroms. It would begin not very deadly, and they would escalate in number and in deadliness over the course of the next 40 years, probably killing over those 4 decades 250,000 Jews, including in World War I and in the Russian Civil War, unrelated to the war itself, just villages burned to the ground.
Yeah.
And that drove millions and millions of Jews to flight and millions of Jews to leave. And right at that period, you begin to see a serious consolidation of what would come to be known as the Zionist movement. And it literally begins, people can look up a guy named Leo Pinsker, who is a Russian integrationist, infatuated with this reformist czar, and then watches the sudden pivot after his death to mass pogroms. And he says, wait a second. The day, by the way, of the Tsar's assassination, that morning he gave the order to establish a parliament for the Russian Empire. He wanted to lead the Russian Empire to what the rest of Europe, Western Europe, Central Europe was becoming. And he says, wait a minute, what if we're living a fantasy? What if this new modernity and liberalism and science and people are discovering electrons and whatever, what if all of this is actually a veneer overlaying a much, much more real trend of consolidation of national identities, of industrialization that was driving people from small places, villages, farms into big cities, and creating these new mass societies and mass identities and radicalized political movements. And all of this stuff, all of these changes would turn on the Jews and turn on the minorities, and we're actually not safe anymore. And there's this entire sociological analysis of modernization that develops that is basically Herzlian Zionism. And Pinsker writes a pamphlet in 1881 called Auto-Emancipation, meaning the emancipation is a series of laws passed by these European countries in the late 19th century that liberate the Jews from the ghettos, liberate the Jews from the restrictions on university and professions and all of that. And he says, what if it's all not real? What if none of this emancipation ultimately will end well? You have to auto-emancipate yourself. That's the only solution. Jews need self-determination. And one of the main arguments that these early Zionists make, these strategic Zionists who awaken because of this sudden turn of Europe on the Jews, is the idea that a Jew cannot stand before the anti-Semite and explain himself. Now, they thought of an anti-Semite as someone to whom the Jew is some kind of moral cartoon, is some kind of antagonist or protagonist in some kind of morality play happening in their own head. In other words, not a human being in front of them, but part of a story they need for their own definition of themselves. That's an anti-Semite. And when you stand before that anti-Semite and you say, oh, no, I'm not this thing you think I am. I'm actually over here, this other thing, this complex three-dimensional human thing. You cannot, these thinkers, the Pinskers and the Herzls say, you cannot penetrate the fog of their morality play. And because you cannot penetrate that fog, you will stand before them and you will try to explain, and you will end up trying to justify. And justifying yourself is dehumanizing. And so you are forbidden to justify yourself. That is not a thing that a Jew with dignity and basic human dignity is permitted to do anymore. And the Zionist movement creates a foundational culture of not justifying yourself. And you had this in the 1950s. David Ben-Gurion would say, when the UN would say something mean to Israel, Ben-Gurion would say, shmum, which means UN shmuen, right? The Yiddishism of saying, who cares about the UN? On I think it was October 15th, 2023, a week after the war began, a week after October 7th, Israel had a Ministry of Public Diplomacy. Call it propaganda, call it public relations, whatever. It's a ministry with that title on the door. And it had founded the Ministry of Public Diplomacy 5 times over the course of its existence, and it keeps shutting it down because it doesn't know what to do with it. And the Minister of Public Diplomacy, a member of Knesset belonging to Netanyahu's Likud party, got up on television and said to Israelis, this is again a week into the war, maybe 10 days into the war, and says to Israelis, look, this is a fake ministry. It's not a real thing. In coalition negotiations, you establish fake ministries to make it easier to hand out, positions to people so the negotiations go easier. I don't mind wasting public funds to make coalition talks easier in peacetime, but I'm not going to waste public funds in wartime. And she resigned right there on national television. And she shut down her ministry. And it was the most patriotic thing she had ever done. And so just to recap, Israel shut down its public diplomacy ministry because a war started, is how bad Israelis at a fundamental cultural level are at the understanding that they have to stand before the world and explain what the heck is going on. In 20 months of war, Netanyahu has not appointed a serious, proper spokesman that anybody knows how to go to and turn to. So you had the UN relief chief say on, I believe it was the BBC a couple of weeks ago, that 14,000 babies were going to die within 48 hours.
Yeah.
Maybe it was a slip of the tongue. It took him an awfully long time to issue a correction. It was such a patent falsehood that was just not humanly possible for that to be even within 3 orders of magnitude of possibility. Even if you hate Israel and wish Israel were destroyed, that still should have actually rung out to you as an obvious lie. But when journalists came looking, there wasn't an Israeli spokesperson they could have called. There just isn't one in government, and they never bothered to establish them. And so this is a world, an entire arena of war that for Hamas is central to their strategy, and for all of its allies is central to their strategy. And the Israelis, because of this cultural kink, we do not stand before the world and justify ourselves. I love this about Israelis, and it is a massive strategic liability in wartime. And that's basically the story. So we can't, by the way, you can get Israelis to take PR seriously if you tell them it hurts the Jews. In other words, you Israelis, great, you don't have to live with these people over in, I don't know what, Denver or London, but the Jews of the diaspora do, and you're hurting them by allowing whatever the most right-wing rabid politician says about emptying Gaza to be the only Israeli voice out there in the world and not the voice of the 80% mainstream of Israeli Jews. And then they say, yeah, no, we should probably do this. But they still don't have the basic cultural sense that this is a thing. So a country with the competence on display over the skies of Iran can't, and by the way, Netanyahu, when he wants to win the next election, is going to hire the best marketing firm that knows how to hack the human brainstem. But they're not going to do it to justify themselves. They can't do it physically. It's a thing that is extremely difficult for an Israeli to undertake culturally.
That's a fascinating answer, and one that I had never heard before.